Welcome to part 2 of 50 States 50 Scenarios. If you haven't watched part 1, click on this link right now. To sum up what we've been doing, I am changing one event in each US state's history and briefly explaining how things could have been different in this alternate scenario. Okay, got it? Here we go. In our timeline, one of the main reasons Maryland stayed with the Union during the Civil War was because of the large free black population in the state. In this alternate timeline, this population doesn't exist, and so secession for the state is a possibility. Maryland secedes and becomes a crucial battleground state during the Civil War. The Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party never occur. The main propaganda and inspirational events in the Revolution don't happen, and so the fuel for rebellion is slower than in our timeline. Perhaps bigger events would happen in other parts of the country. In our timeline, in 1835, a boundary dispute occurred between Michigan and Ohio. Both wanted the area called the Toledo Strip, which contained the city of Toledo located on Lake Erie. After one exchange, the war ended and Ohio gained the land because of its state status. Michigan was given the Upper Peninsula as an exchange. In this alternate timeline, Michigan wins Toledo from Ohio, and the area is under their control to this day. Because of this, the Upper Peninsula is Wisconsin territory. The German and Norwegian immigrants who settle the territory never truly embrace American language and culture. Instead, the immigrants outpopulate the English Americans, and Minnesota becomes a unique state in the US. Just as Puerto Rico is distinct from the states, Minnesota would be a place of pure Germanic culture, where the language would be spoken more often than English. In our timeline, after the Civil War and freeing of African slaves, Mississippi adopted a constitution which respected the rights of both blacks and poor whites. Black farmers settled forested land, cut down the woods, and created a name for themselves as successful landowners. In 1900, 2/3 of the landowners in Mississippi Delta were African American. However, because of economic hardship and a new constitution to restore rich white power, the blacks lost the land and fled to the north. In this alternate timeline, Mississippi is a land of successful agriculture, comprised of black land-owning farmers. Northern black populations, such as in Detroit and Chicago, are never as high because of the economic prosperity in the South. The Missouri Compromise never happens, and Missouri becomes a free state. This causes very heated tensions between the Union and the South, and speeds up the start of the Civil War, perhaps even causing some states to secede. Fierce wars between the US and native tribes eventually lead to the US never occupying Montana, and so Montana stays a collection of tribes which split the region among themselves. The California Gold Rush never brings settlers to Nebraska, and so the land remains unsettled by Europeans until later in the state's history. Vegas never becomes Sin City and stays a small gambling town in the middle of the desert. Nevada's population remains extremely small considering their boom was from the result of tourism into Vegas. Due to an unresolved territorial dispute between Quebec and New Hampshire, the new country of Indian Stream is born. The country stays an independent nation separate from both the US and Canada, and it relies almost entirely on foreign imports. New Jersey in this alternate timeline is a golden land of beauty. Magical unicorns bless every lucky child born into the great state of New Jersey. New York, however, becomes a hell pit populated by nothing but ravenous beavers. The Pueblo people create a massive successful desert empire the size of the Aztecs. It competes with the empire to the south for land in what is now the Chihuahua province. The empires clash with the invading Spanish, but eventually the Pueblo fall just as the Aztec did. New Amsterdam never is annexed by the British, and the Dutch keep their capital on the island of Manhattan. With this, in order to compete with other colonies, the Netherlands spreads its influence across what is today New York, with many small towns dotting the Hudson River. Instead of being split up, the Carolinas remain one large state named Carolina. It becomes comparable in power to New York and is one of the leading states in the US today. Rupert's Land, which included parts of North Dakota, never is given up by the British. Instead, what is today North Dakota is part of Canada, and either an extension of Manitoba or another province altogether. Once factory jobs were moved overseas, instead of Ohio cities falling into economic decline, the state works to reinvent the cities of Toledo and Cleveland, turning them into centers of technological development and not allowing them to fall into dismay. Also, in another scenario, Ohio builds up a great industrialized army and invades its neighbors. Eventually, after years of war, Ohio conquers Washington, D.C. and replaces the American flag. The new national symbol is Brutus the Buckeye. Oklahoma is split up and the 5 tribes create their own separate state called Sequoia. Instead of staying one big American territory, the British and Americans agree to split the territory even more than in our timeline. This results in what we know as Oregon being cut in half, North Oregon being Canadian and South Oregon being American. Philadelphia stays the US capital, exploding the city's population and making it even more of an economic and political hub than it is in our timeline. In our timeline, Secretary Seward made a plan for the United States to purchase Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain for $160 million. However, it was rejected by both Spain and Congress. In this alternate timeline, the US gains both islands from Spain without a conflict or a war, and they become official states in the Union. Early in its history, Rhode Island is combined with Massachusetts, becoming one colony. South Carolina never rejoins the US after the Civil War. In fact, even when the Union tries to take the state by force, the people of the state begin rebelling, eventually pushing the Union out, and starting their own separate nation of South Carolina. This may come as a surprise to some, but Mount Rushmore is actually not completed. Only the heads of the presidents were finished. Much more was in fact planned. In this alternate timeline, the sculpture is finished and the bodies of the presidents are complete. The people of East Tennessee split from the state and formed the state of Franklin. Today it is the poorest state in the US. Instead of joining the US, Texas stays a separate country between the US and Mexico. Even though the nation shares cultural similarities to America, they stay independent up into the 21st century. After overwhelming Mormon support, Congress creates the state of Deseret, which takes up most of the western United States. The state is dominated by Mormon religion, and changes the political and religious ideology of the West. Good old Vermont never wants to join the United States and instead stays between Canada and the US. Virginia never leaves the Union and stays a key figure in the fight against the South. One of the greatest Union generals is Robert E. Lee, who never joins the Confederacy since his home state doesn't secede. With Lee being the greatest general for the Union, the war is much shorter than in our timeline. Russia claims most of Washington as its own in the early 19th century, before Americans or British. More and more Russian colonists set up trading posts and towns in Washington, and after a brief war with many native tribes, claimed the land as part of the Russian Empire. Instead of splitting during the Civil War, West Virginia stays with Virginia, and today the area is one big Virginia state. Today, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is a part of Wisconsin. During the Civil War, the supervolcano under Yellowstone erupts and spreads ash across the continent. Crops and livestock die out, and any economic power the US and Confederacy had is gone. Civilization on the continent panics. The war stops and both countries collapse. Famine and drought spread throughout North America. A mass exodus begins for the Caribbean and Europe. The American population drastically drops as people starve, flee, or die during the chaos. The land becomes desolate, and most of the North American continent becomes a relative wasteland. Well, that was a happy way to end. Think I missed any alternate scenarios from your state? Say it in the comments. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.